Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is the third installment in the Better Sweater series. Today it's all about measurements, gauge, and sweater math. And this video series is intended to accompany our 2018 remake along, in which we're taking sweaters out of our closets that maybe came from big box stores or our grandmothers, and we like them, but we don't like everything about them. So we're remaking them into something that we really like. If you're not able to participate in the remake along for 2018 and you're finding these videos later, my hope is that they will stand alone as a kind of series on design for garments, construction, and modification. Now, in the first couple episodes, we talked about sweater evaluation, whether or not the sweater that you chose is actually a good candidate for this remake along process. And in the second video, we talked about things like design considerations for cables, stitch dictionaries, knitting graph paper, and we talked about yarn choice and how yarn choice can affect your final garment. Today we're going to talk about measurements, not only body measurements, but swatch measurements and swatch gauge and sweater measurements. So it's going to involve some sweater math. We should buckle up for that. It's going to be fun. I do have another video on sweater math that I will likely link to and refer to, so you can go check that one out. And in the meantime, we're going to jump right into some of the measurements and maths that you might need for working on your sweater construction. There are three kinds of measurements we're going to talk about today. The first is body measurements. The second is swatch measurements, and you want to have made a swatch in the yarn of your choice on the needles you plan to use, and in pattern and in stockinette stitch, ideally. And then the last thing we're going to talk about are sweater measurements. And the sweater measurement portion of this is largely for the remake along. In case you want to take something that's already made and make it again, the sweater measurements will help you understand how to read the knitting so that you can replicate a garment fairly well. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is body measurements. Oftentimes in these kinds of instructable videos, I'll have my friend come in and I'd measure her, but I don't have a friend today. So I'm not going to show you how to do a lot of measurements, or the full gamut of measurements, but I will link to a bunch of different resources for you that will tell you which parts of your body you should measure and how to measure them correctly. What I do want to focus on today when I talk about body measurements are a couple of different things. One is that you want to make, your ultimate goal is to make a kind of schematic for your body. And here I'll insert a photo of the schematic that I've made for my measurements. Once you've made your schematic, it's usually pretty good for a few years, unless your body changes size because of various different reasons. You can use that schematic and you don't have to keep measuring your body over and over again. So it's kind of nice. The other thing about body measurement is that you want to make sure that you're not only measuring circumferences or girth, right? So if this model were my friend and I were measuring her, I would want to have a good, flexible measuring tape that I could wrap around the body, and I would want to wrap at certain places like the waist or the hips or the bust. And when you're measuring, you're going to be looking to where the 0 matches up with the actual number. So this reading would give me a 27 for her waist, and I'd want to do the same with the bust and the hips. I'd want to get a measurement on the shoulders. I'd want to have a sense of how wide her wrists were down at the wrist, at the elbow, up toward the shoulder. And there are some standards you can use for those things. I did bring along Maggie Righetti's Knitting in Plain, Sweater Design in Plain English. She has a few appendices in the back of this book. One of them is the National Knit and Crochet Standards. And that will give you, that's available online as well, that will give you some standard measurements. She also includes the Leisure Arts Standards for finished sizes. And so if you're at a loss, say you're knitting for someone who's not actually present, you can use these standards to kind of guesstimate how big an average person is. When we talked about averages in the last episode or last installment, and averages aren't, averages are not true for anybody, really. Everybody has a different kind of body. So it's best if you can measure your own body or measure the body of the person that you're knitting the sweater for. especially in terms of circumference. But the other kind of body measurement you want to make, especially for sweater math, is we're not only worried about going around the body and thinking about stitch count, but we're worried about the length of the body for row count. So you want to also use your tape measure to measure things like how far up is the natural waist from the hip? How far up is the bust? Right? Like, what are the dimensions here to here and here to here, and what's the total length? And the same for arms. That'll help you get the right sleeve length. So you want to be thinking both about girth and circumference and about length, because the length is going to tell you when you need to be putting your increases or decreases in, at what point in your progression up or down the sweater, right? So that's your measurements, and you need to make a schematic for yourself that will help you lead you through the process. Now remember that your body measurements are not your sweater measurements necessarily, because you also want to think about ease. So let's say you had a bust of, say, 38 inches. If you wanted a kind of a snug sweater that kind of sat right up against your body, then yeah, sure, you'd want to make your sweater circumference at that point about 38 inches. But most of us like to have a little ease in our garments so that we can move around and have some wiggle room. And ease can be anything that you want it to be. There's no absolute standard or rule or what's right about that. For me, I tend to like 2 inches of ease or so in my sweaters. It just gives me enough room to move, but it doesn't make it baggy. If you wanted a really form-fitting sweater, you would want to think about negative ease. What I just described is positive ease, giving it a little extra room. Negative ease kind of pulls the garment in toward the body. And if you're interested in a really tight-fitting sweater and you had a 38-inch bust, maybe you want to make a size 36. That's totally up to you. You just have to decide ahead of time as you're kind of thinking through your pattern how you want this sweater to fit in the end. Okay, so if that's body measurements, and those are the kind of important things to think about, then you've got to think about how to transfer those body measurements into actual knitting, right? And you do that through a gauge swatch. So this is my remake along sweater, as many of you know, and it's from a big box store. It's got cables in the front and a kind of reversed stockinette back, which I'm not totally crazy about. That's one of the things I think I'll change. Since I'm working on cables, I needed to make a swatch with the yarn that I chose that included these kinds of cables so that I'd know what my width measurement is for those cables, so I can guesstimate how many stitches to cast on, etc., etc. So this is my gauge swatch. I think you'll be able to see it on here. And I've included a 5x5 cable up here, and that is very similar to this cable in the middle here. Not exactly, but pretty similar. And I've included some 2x2 cables down here. And those 2x2 cables are meant to mimic the 2x2 that I have going on either side of the sweater. I also did some stockinette. And my stockinette's a little small. In general, the rule would be to make at least a 6x6 inch swatch so that you're not measuring your rows and your stitches along the edges, which can sometimes pucker or roll. If you make at least a 6x6 inch swatch, then you can measure that center portion for your 4 inches to see what kind of gauge you're getting. With cables, I would recommend at least, this is a fairly small swatch, actually. Most people who are doing cables might do something bigger than this. But you want to at least make the width a full repeat of your pattern so that you can measure the width of your cables. And that's what I've done here. Now, once you have your gauge swatch, you're going to measure your gauge, and gauge is measured both rows and stitch count. So you would need, I always use a handy wooden ruler because I like things simple. And you would lay this flat on a table, and you would measure how many stitches you get for 4 inches, and then divide that number by 4. I happen to get 20 stitches for 4 inches, so I know I have a 5 stitch per inch gauge. When you do rows, this is why my stockinette's a little bit small here, you would ideally want at least 4 inches. I went with 2 because I know my stockinette pretty well, and I'm pretty efficient with it, and it comes out the same all the time, pretty much. So I measured 2 inches and see how many rows I'm getting. And for this particular gauge swatch, I was getting 14 rows over 2 inches or 7 rows an inch. So those two measurements, the 5 stitches per inch and 7 rows per inch, are going to help me know how many stitches to cast on and where I need increases and decreases. And it's going to tell me how many rows I need to get to a certain point. So how many rows do I need to get from the hips to the waist, from the waist to the bust, etc. So as many of you know, if you've ever done any kind of sweater math before, converting what you have here on your gauge swatch into actual sweater measurements can take a lot of different time and consideration. And I'm going to talk about a few of those considerations in just a few minutes. But very basically, let's just say you were going to make a pullover that was plain stockinette. You could use your stitch gauge. Let's just say it's 5 stitches an inch, and all I wanted to make was a plain stockinette pullover. And I knew that my hip measurement where I'm going to cast on my bottom-up sweater was, let's say, 35 inches. If my hip measurement is 35 inches and my stitches per inch are 5, I would multiply 35 inches times 5, and that number would be the number of stitches that I would cast on if I were working on in the round on the whole sweater. Now, if you were working flat and pieces, you'd want to take 35 at first and divide it by 2 so that you know you got your front and your back. Some people like to add a few extra stitches to the front and leave a few not in the back. It all depends. I tend to just split it in half. So you take your 35 stitches, split them in half, and then multiply that number by 5, and that would give you the number of stitches that you'd want to cast on for your bottom of your sweater. As you were working up row-wise, you'd want to think about the measurement at your middle, at your waist, and what the difference is between this 35 inches and maybe it's 25 inches, maybe it's 30 inches, who knows. And so you got to think to yourself, well, I need to lose 5 inches, let's say it's 35 to 30, I need to lose 5 inches over so many rows. And that's where some of that sweater math that I talk about in the other video comes in handy. So I'll refer you over there, okay? Okay, so now that we've talked about body measurements and swatch measurements, let's talk a little bit about sweater measurements. And this is particularly important for this remake along project because if you're trying to remake a sweater, you need to know what's going on in the sweater. Now for me, one of the things that I had to do was to think about the number of stitches that were in each cable chart, each cable pattern, portion of the pattern, how many stitches were in between the cable portions, and then how many stitches are over here toward my selvage edge of the sweater. I did some measuring and some counting, and I'll show you on the sheet. I'll insert a little photo here. What I did is just write it out. So I knew that there are 6 stitches over here, and if you can't read reverse stockinette to count, you can always flip your sweater inside out, and it becomes very easy to read the number of stitches that you've got there. I think you can see that there. So this sweater has 6 stitches here. It has a cable pattern that is 12 stitches wide, has another 2 stitches, 2 stitches, 2 stitches, and then a cable pattern that is 15 stitches wide, 2 stitches, 2, 2, again, a repeat of our 12 stitch wide pattern, 2, 2, 2, a repeat of our 15 stitch pattern, 2, 2, 2, a repeat of our 12 stitch pattern, and then our 6 stitches over toward the selvage. So that's what the front looks like. And so that helps me figure out what's going on with this sweater in terms of thinking about how many stitches they were using to get across the front and to accomplish those cables. Now, if you were to look at the ribbing down here at the bottom, you would notice 2 things. One is that the ribbing is smaller stitches. So a smaller size needle was used, probably 2 needle sizes down. And so if you look at the number of stitches cast on for the ribbing versus the number of stitches in the pattern up here for the main body, there's a big difference. And that's in part because when you use smaller needles to accomplish the same girth, you need to have more stitches. But it's also because of a cable splay situation. This is a cable sweater, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if you look at the back, there's actually a different number of stitches going on. And I found that The back actually had fewer stitches cast on for the ribbing. I'm just looking at my notes right here. And when it went up to this reverse stockinette portion, it ended with fewer stitches than in the front because of that cable splay situation and because of the reverse stockinette situation. So those are some design considerations that I'll take into account when I remake this sweater. Whether or not I want to make sure that I cast on more stitches in the front and fewer in the back, I think that seems like a reasonable thing to do. But also the cable splay situation. The other thing to think about are the what you can read off of your sweater measurements are things like your increases and your decreases. So I can see that this sweater increases right about here up to the armpit and the bust line. If I turn the sweater inside out, and I'm going to insert some photos here so that you can see, you can count the number of increases in your sweater, or decreases as the case may be, by looking at the inside of your sweater to see where those stitch counts vary. I find it really helpful to make a schematic of the sweater. So I'll again insert some photos here of the schematics I made for this particular sweater. I have one for the front, one for the back, and one for the sleeves, in which I've done some measurements to try to get a sense of what's going on in this pattern so that I can then think about what I want to do in my own remake of this sweater. The last thing to think about is actually probably the first thing to think about, which is what gauge is your sweater knit at? And you can do a couple different things that to figure that out. So for me, the easiest way to get a stockinette measurement on this sweater is this reverse stockinette portion turned inside out. And look at that, little acres and acres of stockinette. So I measured my gauge on the stockinette here, and it actually came out to be the same gauge as the gauge I'm getting on my swatch, which is 5 stitches per inch. Convenient. And then the other measurements that you might take, especially if you're doing cables, are to do something very simple, which is to say, how wide, let's say, how wide is my 5x5 cable in my gauge? And it's about 2 inches or so. I'm not being exact because you would do this on a flat surface. And if I measure my 5x5 cross here, it's about 2 inches. So that gives me a sense, and I did the same with this pattern as well, that gives me a sense that the way that I'm knitting my gauge swatch and the information that I'm getting off of my gauge swatch is going to then translate very well to remaking this sweater if I use parts of this sweater as a schematic for what I end up doing. Okay, so those are 3 really important things: your body measurements, your gauge swatch measurements, and your sweater measurements. But the other thing to think about are some little considerations that will help make your sweater better. The first is you want to think about, as I mentioned before, you want to think about ease. So when you measure your sweater, if you like the way it fits, look at how much ease it has compared to your body measurements. So if my body measurements say that I'm a 34 on the bust circumference, and this sweater measures, let's say, 36, that tells me that that 2 inches of ease is something that I like on my body. It feels good. If I were to measure my bust and find that it's 33 and this sweater happens to be 33, well, it turns out I like sweaters that sit more close to my body, at least with this configuration. So you can use your sweater measurements versus your body measurements to check how much ease you actually like in a garment. The second consideration would be thinking about your ribbing and your needle size. I don't like tight ribbing. So one of the things I'm not going to do is go down a needle size. I usually do my ribbing in the same needle size that I knit the garment. And for some people that's like sacrilegious, but it's just something that I believe in because I like the way it fits me. But you may want your ribbing to go down a size. And as I mentioned before, if you're going to have smaller needles, it's going to be more stitches per inch. So you've got to think about how many you need to cast on to get your ribbing accomplished. Another thing to think about, often sweaters will have short rows added in the back. And that is to help the back, you can see in the sweater a little bit, sit up higher than the front so that you don't get choked out. You can add your short rows in a number of ways, in a number of places. I tend to add them in here somewhere, and you can use any method for that. You could use a wrap and turn. I prefer German short rows because they don't leave any holes or marks. You can barely see them. and you just need, oh, maybe 2 or 3 rows of them even, just to make a difference and to lift that back up just a little bit. I feel like an evangelist for these back shore rows, but in every video that I talk about sweaters, I talk about adding them in. So think about adding them in now at the very beginning when you're working up your pattern for your sweater. The last thing to mention here is selvage. So if you're going to knit your sweater in the round, you're not going to have a selvage, because a selvage is where 2 pieces of fabric come together and need to be closed up, sewn together. So if you're working in the round, this is not necessarily a consideration for you. If you're going to work your sweater in pieces, as I will, because this is a cabled sweater and I want to give it some more structure, this seam here is going to eat up a few stitches, you know? And so what's going to make me feel comfortable about getting the right measurement in the end is whatever number of stitches I decide to cast on for my girth or width for the sweater, the back and the front. I'm going to add 2 stitches here, 2 stitches here, and 2 and 2 on the other side as well. That way when you go to seam up your sweater and you get this little puckered bit here, you're not eating into the actual girth of the sweater, you're just using up those extra selvage stitches for your seaming, and that way you're not losing any girth for your sweater. Now if you don't plan those stitches in, what can happen is, let's say you have a stitch gauge of 4 stitches an inch, and you go to seam this up and you eat up 4 stitches or maybe even 8, depending on which, doing both sides, then you would be out an extra inch of fabric. And that's a lot, and it might make a big difference in the fit of the sweater. So think about your selvages if you're going to be seaming pieces together. Now there are a couple of special considerations for things like cables, lace, color work. Let's start with color work because I'm going to go into the cables toward the end. Color work, a couple of considerations. The tightness of your floats. You want to make sure that your floats are laying really flat and neat across the back of your sweater. They're not too loose and they're not too tight, because otherwise it'll winch up your fabric and make it pucker, and it won't look as good. And the other consideration for color work is if you're going to steek. So kind of like the selvage as we were talking about here, if I were to steek this sweater down the middle to make it a cardigan, I'd want to make sure that I built in some extra stitches here for the cutting, because you don't want to cut into your actual fabric. You want to be, you're cutting into your actual fabric, but you don't want to cut into the meat of your fabric. You want to cut into a special section that you've created just in stockinette stitch. So if I were to cut into this sweater, I would plan to add 5 or 6 stitches in the middle here, and that way when I cut into those stitches, the edges could curl back and I could tack them down, no problem. There's also lace to consider. If you're working up a sweater that has huge lace panels, you want to remember that it's kind of the opposite problem of color work and cables, in that lace opens when you block it, right? So if cables squinch, lace likes to lay flat and open if you block it that way. And so in your considerations for things like girth and measurement and gauge, you want to be thinking about what that lace looks like when it lays open and how big does it actually get. Okay, so cables are a special consideration because of what I call squinch and splay. Now splay is a more common term that you'll probably hear associated with cables. And this, I'll show you this particular swatch from Cable Left, Cable Right, which I've been using as a way to kind of classify my cables, like a field guide to cables. She talks about take up and splay. I call it squinch and splay. And you can probably see in this swatch here, cables cinch in your fabric, right? And so you've got to do a couple of things to avoid squinch and splay. The first is you want to plan for your fabric, if it's covered in cables, to be smaller than your fabric that's just stockinette. Now there are various people who would say various algorithms for how to figure that out. The best thing you can do is to just swatch and figure out and you can see on the swatch what the difference is in width with your cables versus your stockinette, right? But the other thing you can do is, especially if you're going to do ribbing along the bottom of a sweater, is you can build in an adjustment for cable splay. And If you want a rough ratio, it's about a 2/3 ratio, as far as I can figure. You say 4 stitches for every 6 stitches of cable knitting. So if I have a total of 100 stitches that I'm probably going to cast on, or 100 stitches that I am going to end up with for cables for this particular garment, my cast on for the ribbing is going to be far less than that. It's going to be about 77 stitches. And the reason for that is because these cables pull in, what I'm going to want to do is do some increases right after the last ribbing row. I'm going to do some increases into my cables so that the cables don't cause the ribbing to kind of flare out because they're squinching up tighter. And so I'm going to cast on, most likely, so far my math is telling me about 77 stitches in ribbing. And then when I get to that last row of ribbing, I'm going to increase all the way around into those cables so that when I do the cables, I'll be up to about 100 stitches for these cables around the front. So that's what I call squinch and splay. And there is a way to fix it. So you just have to think about it ahead of time. Okay, so last time your homework was to go out and find yarn that you thought would be appropriate for the design choices that you're making. This time your homework is to make your gauge swatches, if you haven't already, measure your body, and measure your sweater. Do a little investigation and see what it is that you get when you get your measurements. And then you can go check out that sweater math video, which will help walk you through a little bit of how to make those adjustments horizontally and vertically to the sweater construction that you're putting together. Pretty soon, I'll be putting out installment number 4 of this series, and I look forward to seeing you guys there. Please leave questions, comments, pattern notes, all that kind of stuff here. And I'll put up, we have a Ravelry thread going on for the remake along. You can post questions there as well. So keep them coming. It's great to interact with you guys and to see all your projects starting to take shape. And next time we'll be moving on to writing up the patterns for our actual sweater. Take care, and I'll see you next time.